Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us at today's Singapore International Energy Week Global Launch. The program will begin shortly. Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the global launch of the 14th Singapore International Energy Week, or SIEW. My name is Serene Chua, your host from the Energy Market Authority. To begin the program, I have the pleasure to invite Mr. Richard Lim, Chairman of the Energy Market Authority, for his opening remarks. Mr. Lim, please.
Honored guests, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the global launch of the 14th Singapore International Energy Week, or SIEW as we call it. It is good afternoon in Singapore, and I offer you my greetings appropriate to your specific time zone for those joining us from other locations. With your strong support over the last 14 years, SIEW has become a major platform for energy discussions impacting Asia and the world. Last year, we held SIEW in a hybrid format for the first time, given the challenging constraints imposed by the global pandemic. It was the first such conference event in Singapore, involving the physical presence of about 250 people on site and many more online from many parts of the world. We received positive feedback and suggestions. Hence, this year, SIEW will again feature a week of engaging energy discussions, both on-site and online. SIEW will be especially significant this year for us in Singapore, as 2021 also marks the 20th anniversary of the Energy Market Authority, or EMA. This is an important year for energy discussions, given the urgency to tackle climate change. The United Nations High-Level Dialogue on Energy and the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP26, will convene energy players to shape our future energy landscape. SIEW this year will add to these discussions as a key platform for Singapore and the region to contribute to this global energy dialogue. I am delighted to announce this year's theme for SIEW. It is Advancing the Energy Transition. Advancing the Energy Transition. At SIEW 2021, we will explore how we can work together to accelerate the transition to actionable pathways towards a low-carbon energy future. We will also focus on the role of innovation in building a more sustainable energy future. The energy transition will mean adopting greener energy sources and also changing our lifestyles to reduce energy consumption. And while low-carbon energy sources are gaining ground, challenges remain. According to the International Renewable Energy Agency, or IRENA, the pace of the energy transition is far from what is needed to be in line with the Paris Agreement. If policies are not fully implemented, emissions could potentially rise by 27% over the coming 3 decades. As we recover from the pandemic, we will also need to balance economic growth with energy sustainability. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, reported that global energy CO2 emissions are expected to see its second largest annual increase of almost 5%, or 1,500 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2021. This is a worrying trend, and particularly critical in Asia, where we expect to see significant growth in energy demand. According to the IEA, Southeast Asia is one of the fastest growing regions in terms of energy demand, growing by more than 6% annually over the last 20 years. Therefore, there is greater need for international collaboration to advance the energy transition and create a more sustainable energy future through initiatives such as increased electrification, regional grids, and technology-enabled innovation. There are also opportunities to work together to create business opportunities, green jobs, and support for infrastructure investment. These will enhance energy resilience and ensure a just and inclusive future for all. To address these energy issues impacting Asia, SIEW 2021 will bring together several new conferences this year. For the first time, Singapore and the IRENA will co-host the inaugural Singapore IRENA High-Level Forum. The forum will discuss mobilizing investments to support the low-carbon energy transition and to mitigate climate change. A new conference on the future of the grid will also examine grid optimization and the impact of electrification. SIEW will also feature our returning partner events, focusing on key industry sectors. Asia Clean Energy Summit will examine the role of renewable and clean energy in the transition. The Asian Downstream Summit, co-located with the Asian Refining Technology Conference, will focus on sustainability and productivity in refining and petrochemicals. The LNG and Hydrogen Markets Asia Conference will share insights on the growth and development of LNG and hydrogen in the region. Other key events such as Singapore IEA Forum, SIEW Energy Insights, and SIEW Think Tank Roundtables will showcase perspectives from renowned international organizations and industry captains. I would like to thank our speakers for joining us today to kickstart these discussions, and to all present here for your strong support. Finally, I would like to invite all of you to join us either on-site or online at the 14th SIEW, taking place from the 25th to the 29th of October at Marina Bay Sands, Singapore. Thank you very much. I wish you a fruitful discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Lim. Let us now take a look at what you can look forward to at SIEW 2021. Next, we have a special message from the Deputy Director General of the International Renewable Energy Agency, Gauri Singh. Deputy Director General, please.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are living in unprecedented times. The global pandemic has brought stark awareness about the potential fallout of climate change. The window of opportunity to achieve the goals set out by the Paris Agreement is closing fast. The recent trends show that the gap between where we are and where we need to be is widening. IRENA recently released its first World Energy Transitions Outlook. It showcases an ambitious, though technically and economically feasible pathway for deploying low-carbon technologies to limit the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade and bringing the carbon emissions to net zero by mid-century. The premise for the 1.5 scenario developed by IRENA is that carbon emissions need to fall 3.5% year on year to reach net zero by 2050. Renewables will play a key role in the decarbonization. Over 90% of the solutions in 2050 involve renewable energy through direct supply, electrification, energy efficiency, green hydrogen, and biomass with CCS. This outlook comes at a time when acting fast and bold on global climate pledges is critical, this being the year of UN high-level dialogue on energy and COP26 at Glasgow. Meeting carbon reduction targets by 2050 will require a combination of technology and innovation, supportive policies to bring benefit from job creation and increase in GDP, and international cooperation to accelerate actions for energy access. IRENA's 1.5 degree centigrade pathway sees electricity becoming the main energy carrier in 2050, with renewable power capacity expanding more than tenfold over the same period. While the scenario is ambitious but achievable, the momentum is growing fast, with major economies accounting for over 70% of global carbon dioxide emissions having pledged carbon neutrality in the coming decades. Financial markets and investors are also making the shift by moving capital into sustainable energy assets. Every country will have its own unique pathway, but all countries can realize immense socioeconomic benefits by placing energy transition at the heart of their COVID response. Ambition and decisive action on NDCs will help define short-term goals and actions within the larger long-term frame of energy transition. This pandemic has demonstrated our ability to take purposeful and collective action, bringing together partnerships, political commitment, and ambition. It is a pleasure to partner with Singapore International Energy Week, which is an important annual platform, brings together a wide audience of energy policymakers, industry leaders, and thought leaders. The theme this year is also very good because it keeps with the ongoing global efforts, and IRENA is working closely with our friends in Singapore to put energy transition at the heart of the Singapore International Energy Week this year. See you in October. Thank you.
Thank you for the insightful message, Deputy Director General. To pose a question, please use the Q&A feature. Let us know your name, organization, and if the question is directed to a particular speaker. May I now invite Mr. Dolph Gillen for his presentation on IRENA's World Energy Transition Outlook Report. Mr. Gillen, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to provide you a little bit more insights on what Gauri Singh just explained. So, some of you may have attended our presentation last year, where we presented a 2-degree scenario. And what we've done this year is develop a 1.5-degree scenario, so an even more ambitious scenario. And 1.5 degree means global net zero emissions by 2050. We find that the direction of travel for the 1.5 degree scenario is very much the same as for the 2-degree scenario. So renewable energy has a key role to play in this transition, and it can play that role because the economics have improved significantly in recent years, and they will continue to improve in the coming years. And that means there is now a perspective for an energy transition that can create additional jobs and that can create additional economic growth. So a win-win situation, if you like. If you move to the next slide, the key component of such a transition is cleaning up the power sector. And that's where renewables can play a key role. And in a Southeast Asian context, of course, the main discussion is for the coming decade around coal power. We're talking not only stopping growth, stopping adding coal power, we're talking reducing coal power generation. And then subsequently introducing more and more renewables. That's let's say that's in a Southeast Asian context important, but of course that's all over Asia important. It's the same for China, it's the same for India and other countries. The investment opportunity is significant. We see an investment need between now and 2050 of $131 trillion US. I would say that's an enormous sum, but it's, if you compare it to the reference case, it's an increase about 1/3 in terms of investment needs. If you move to the next slide. So the rapid cost reduction of renewable technologies enables this transition. And I show you here an example for solar PV, which is of course a very prominent example how significantly the costs have come down. And you see that the ASEAN cost averages in red have come down in line with the global averages. And this results now in significant uptake. And if you take now the example of Vietnam, for example, the PV generation capacity has grown from 1% to 25% of total generation capacity in only 3 years. So massive, very significant change, and that will be repeated elsewhere in the region, simply driven by the economics. Next slide, please. So renewable power is important. We also see interesting opportunities for direct application of renewables, notably bioenergy in the region, and I'll come to that point. But it needs to be combined with higher energy efficiency. It needs to be combined with electrification of end users, notably electromobility. We will need clean hydrogen, and we also need some CCS. A little bit for process emissions in industry, but we also see an important role for biomass combined with CCS in such a transition. So there are 6 components of the energy transition strategy. The relative importance of these 6 components varies a little bit by region and by country, but it's roughly these 3 main components we see everywhere: renewables, energy efficiency, electrification of end use. Next slide, please. And the consequence of that is that the use of fossil fuels will decline. We still see fossil fuel use going forward even to 2050, notably natural gas, but you see that the total use of fossil fuels declines by 3/4, and that especially coal use declines because coal is the most carbon intensive type of fossil fuel. Next slide, please. So fossil fuel use declines. At the same time, you see a massive ramp up of the yellow area here. So on the line left, you have the 2018 situation. Right side is the 1.5 degree scenario. You see electricity grows from 21% to 51% of final energy use. And you see also that modern biomass grows significantly to 18%, and hydrogen grows significantly. And hydrogen, about 2/3 of that hydrogen is green hydrogen produced with renewable electricity. So direct electrification, indirect electrification via hydrogen, and modern biomass play a key role in decarbonizing buildings, industry, and transport. Next slide, please. So, and we see roughly the same trends also for ASEAN region. So a significant shift to renewables, which is illustrated here in the dark blue. So 3/4 renewables in primary energy supply by 2050 in Paris compatible scenarios. Next slide, please. And so one specific element I wanted to highlight is that we also see a key role for bioenergy in the ASEAN region. We're just completing another study on that area that reconfirms that again. There are significant residues available that can be deployed, and they can provide up to 40% of energy by 2050. So bioenergy in an ASEAN context deserves special relevance, apart from, of course, solar PV, wind, geothermal, hydro, and all the other forms of renewable energy. So that was a very brief overview of our findings, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gillen. To pose a question, please use the Q&A function. Let us know your name, organization, and if the question is directed to a particular speaker. For our on-site delegates, please email your question to ema_SIEW@ema.gov.sg. Joining the discussions now are Ms. SIEW Uzil from Envision Digital and Mr. Tom Moody from the UK Climate Change and Energy Network in Southeast Asia. Moderating the session for us is Mr. James Chong from Accenture. I'll now hand over to Mr. Chong.
Thank you. Thank you. Good afternoon, and welcome to the first of 2 panels this afternoon that we have with you here. With us here, in addition to Dolph, whom you've just heard from, is Sylvie, as well as Mr. Tom Moody from the UK Climate Change and Energy Network. So let me start off by following up with the point that Dolph had just made, if you don't mind, which is around the broad challenges, Dolph, that you see in the region adopting some of these policies and the transition. What's your view on that?
Well, let's say for some years that there was a notion that coal is the cheapest form of power, and therefore we need to expand coal. you see that is gradually changing. So the global improvements in the economics of renewables are catching up in the region. And you see now some very fast change happening. I mean, I gave the example of Vietnam. We expect that will be repeated elsewhere. So that innovation, technology innovation, and is driving this transition, and that is a global trend.
Right. Thanks, Dolph. Tom, if I may switch to you as president of COP26, how you see the WETO report that was just published and its alignment to the COP26 aims. Similarly, what are the kind of challenges that you would see for the region in attaining that?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I mean, I think the first thing to say is we really welcome the report, particularly the emphasis on keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, which is a clear goal of the UK as holders of the COP presidency. And I think also just to bring out the fact that in the report we talk about the role of the private sector and how that is often ahead of the public sector in recognising the risks and the opportunities of the transition. I really welcome the emphasis too on the green recovery and the opportunity that gives us. In the UK, our green recovery plan, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, aims to grow 250,000 new jobs there. So, it's being seen by us and other major economies as industrial renewal. In terms of the challenges, we really recognise that COVID-19 has reduced the fiscal space for governments to drive forward on this agenda. But as Dolph had said, as various other IRENA reports have said in the past, the economic case for transition is completely clear. The IRENA's outlook for Southeast Asia points to 6.5 million new jobs being created by a clean transition and a further 3% economic growth on top of the sort of baseline. And that's really important to recognise when we look at the World Bank's projections, which predict that this region will rebound very quickly and get back to that sort of 6% annual growth. So we need to make sure that choice is correct. We also, I think, need to recognise the challenges around just transition. So we need to ensure that the employment that is around the sort of coal sector particularly is transferred across and we grow the skills in green jobs in a just way. And the UK has a lot of experience of that. Some learn the hard way, to be honest. And around the access to finance point. So a real priority of the COP presidency is to ensure that the developed world lives up to its responsibility to provide $100 billion a year towards developing countries to support that transition. We're leading from the front in that. We've doubled our international climate contribution to 11.6 billion UK pounds over the next 5 years. We welcome the US commitment last week to do the same. So that's really fantastic. The other ways that I just want to point to in terms of how we're addressing and we're supporting that work is particularly through the COP26 work is something called Energy Transition Councils. And we launched those in December. We had the second ministerial just last week and 9 countries have had dialogues on that with multi-donor interest and 2 regional dialogues. So that has already started to achieve some impact, and we had a rapid response facility launched this week, which the COP president launched to try and support the technical assistance that's required to come in and help. Thanks.
Right. Thank you. If I can just switch gears a bit, Sylvie. I mean, you've heard about a combination of the just transition, the diverse environments in APAC. How do you think from a technology standpoint you see that being a tool to help all these aims for both these organizations?
Thank you. So, as we described, renewables are all about technology. Their price follows very steep Moore laws, and with floating and offshore, we are now pushing the boundaries of natural resources. So, in theory, we could provide a couple of US cent renewable per kilowatt hour renewable electricity to underpin the development in a sustainable way for the main needs. However, renewables are also coming with intermittency, with mushrooming of decentralized generation and uncharted consumption behaviors with new electrification, such as EVs. So they are creating shocks to the grid from both ends, which have to be resolved. And if you look at Europe, which is a bit more advanced in terms of renewable penetration, Europe only is today investing 100 billion euro per year in grid reinforcement. And the plan is to inject 14 trillion by 2050. So clearly, grid reinforcement is generating enormous capex, opex, also delays, also environmental impact. So that's why digital technology needs to come with industrial technology to provide today digital grid by orchestration, by AI and IoT. So by forecasting, high-resolution forecasting of weather, supply, demand, by smart optimization using artificial intelligence to optimize what can be controlled and what can be stored. And by actual controls with low latency IoT, you can create digital grid. So one concrete example, instead of charging every EV when you arrive in the morning in your office garage and you plug in at 8 a.m. or you arrive at home at 7 p.m. in the evening and charging everybody full-fledged, you can actually orchestrate, you can actually balance, you can actually also charge on demand because people drive in average in Europe, for instance, 45 kilometers per day, 15% only of the battery capacity. So with smartness, you can virtually multiply the grid by 10 without having to physically expand it. So we leverage those technologies to decarbonize today campuses, smart cities. It's totally within reach. And we're starting to attack with digital technology the next challenge, which is to decarbonize heavy industrial processes, thanks to a real-time carbon monitoring of scope 3 abroad. So knowing and measuring real-time the emissions of your supply chain and your supplier's supply chain, credible granular offsetting. So the next generation of virtual PPAs by real-time offsetting. And last but not least, green hydrogen, which is definitely a key component of the solution. So we are very proud to be together with WEF working on net zero industry parks, piloting in some regions, notably in China, in Inner Mongolia, but also in some UK regions in Sunderland, how to not only decarbonize campuses and cities, but also industry parks, which are obviously the next frontier, I would say.
I mean, you've brought up the fact that for adoption, and so have our guests as well, depends heavily on an ecosystem of regulation, policies, funding, working together to ensure that the right approach is taken and also the right components are there. What do you think is your view from a technology perspective are priorities to, what I know you mentioned, priming the pump, to get things going over the critical mass. What do you think are some of the approaches and priorities that they should take?
Yeah, so I think the topic of energy is extremely systemic.
Right.
So you need really a consistent system design as well as some catalysts to actually initiate the reaction, I would say. And so public powers and the states have a key role to play. And I think there are four dimensions the public powers need to actually architecture and, I would say, speed up or play a catalyst role for. The first one is really to prime the pump, because yes, we are in front of more laws, but at the beginning, you still need to initiate and to push until you reach the point where the models are economically profitable. Only long-term sustainable economic models will work, but you need, of course, to bridge the gap at the beginning. And feed-in tariff, for instance, for electricity play a key role to attract early investors, but obviously the long-term model needs to be sustainable. The second role, I think, of public powers is to create positive and negative incentives to push toward energy transition and, again, to accelerate. One example, I think, again, looking at Europe, is around electric vehicle adoption, where the first big stick which was put forward is the so-called CAFE tax, which is putting a tax on the scope 3 emissions of car manufacturers, the emissions of the cars they put on the road. And this CAFE tax would have driven taxes of hundreds of millions, if not billions, for the biggest players, had they not changed the footprint of their cars, had they not electrified their product range. And so this big stick, coupled with some very nice carrots, notably smart incentives for EV charging, giving 900 euro, for instance, to consumers in Germany to buy a smart EV chargers, or 2,500 euros to corporations to adopt fast chargers. So this type of positive incentives, so carrots and not only sticks, led Germany virtually in a couple of years to move from almost no EVs, and this is, as you know, the country of cars, to actually 22% of new passenger vehicles sold in 2020 being EVs, hybrid and battery vehicles, ahead of the US, of overtaking the US, and just second to China. So clearly this key mix of positive and negative incentive to accelerate is also where we need some state interventions, I would say. States also play a key role in supporting the deployment of critical infrastructures. Of course, smartly orchestrated EV charging infrastructures, as in Singapore we see some measures being announced, but also topics like grid interconnections with neighboring countries and not so neighboring countries producing renewable electricity. Also gas grid to transport green hydrogen from places where you have abundant, cheap solar energy, such as Spain in Europe, to places where you have plants, such as Germany in Europe, so gas infrastructure. And last but not least, in terms of the role of states to design the consistent architecture, carbon economy, carbon currency is absolutely key. So renewable energy certificates, incentives to organizations and consumers for providing flexibility to the grid. And if you look at green hydrogen, in my opinion, one of the reasons for which we don't see faster investments happening is the lack of clarity around the model for guarantee of origin, carbon credits, virtual hydrogen purchase agreements, so the VHPPA, the equivalent of PPAs, which would allow to blend green hydrogen into the grid and get some carbon credit for doing so. So this type of setup being unclear, the first early investors are still struggling with the model, basically. So I think the states have a key role to architecture this whole consistency in all those dimensions and play as catalysts on critical points of the system.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, funding and finances is often a very good incentive kind of structure. And Tom, I want to move to you. I know you've got views around how private-public partnerships can play a significant role in that, and you spoke about grid electrification, a lot of responsibilities that are part of governments, right? So Tom, how do you see the PPP kind of arrangements helping in this?
Yeah, I mean, it very much is a partnership. I mean, I talked earlier about at a sort of political level, the public sector, the donors, but private sector, I think I would describe private sector is increasingly seeing the transition towards Paris compliance, 1.5 degrees, as inevitable. So the choice is really whether it's a smooth transition or it's a bumpy one with costly adjustment. So as well as the information that's been talked about earlier, there was a University of Oxford report last week which talked about investors now wanting 4 times the level of returns on coal projects compared to a renewable project before they will invest in it. So the hurdle rate has drastically increased. I think that's the risk side, but the opportunity side is enormous too. We look at the level of stock growth from companies like Tesla, NextEra, and Sembcorp, in Singapore recently. That all points to the fact that it is a huge opportunity for the private sector. Where the public sector, I think, needs to partner more closely, and what we're really pushing for in the COP presidency is around a clear strategy. So the COP26 presidency has a private finance strategy about this. So we have several strands. I'll run through them very briefly, but reporting, which is about things like TCFD to ensure that responds to the demand from investors to show where their money is going. Risk management, and that's very much the role of central monetary authorities to stress test and ensure that the wider system stands up to that risk. returns. So, you know, going back to the point Dolph made about the $131 trillion investment need, we need to make sure that the returns around that are, you know, incentivizing that investment and disincentivizing investment into areas like coal. And then, of course, mobilization. So we have work going on led by our COP26 finance envoy to scale voluntary carbon markets, for example, by 15 times by 2030, which we think is necessary to respond to the need for transition. The final point I'll just make is about our COP26 president talks about this being a whole of economy effort. In January, he launched something called Race to Zero Breakthroughs. And we see Race to Zero is a UNFCCC concept and campaign around non-state actors getting behind the transition. And the COP president sees that we need to get to a tipping point by the time of the COP conference in November of about 20% of around 10 key sectors, which will create that virtuous circle with public sector to allow us to really tip over the edge into transition. And we're holding an event in May for ASEAN around that. Thank you.
Right, right. No, you talked about tipping the tipping point and probably acceleration of the transition. Dolph, if I may go back to you on recent events like the Biden summit that seems to have accelerated and with new pledges, etc., that were quite surprising to the market. How do you see that accelerating things in the region here in Asia?
Well, I think it sent a very important signal. So the major economies have jointly agreed that this is the direction of travel. So, and of course, that will put political pressure also on the region to move in the same direction. All these events are now building up to the COP, and that is, of course, a critical moment. The revision of the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, is such a critical moment. We need also for the financing, what Tom mentioned, the right signals. So the 100 billion is symbolically very important. I mean, compared to the trillions that are needed, of course, it's not, but politically, it's really important that such commitments are indeed met. And what we need, what Sylvia also said, I mean, we need to get the flexibility, we need to have the enabling frameworks in place now, we need to have the market signals in place, the right pricing of electricity to reflect scarcity. But on the technology side, I would say we're close to what we need.
Okay, let me touch on one topic which both Tom and Sylvie, you mentioned, right? Which is around the transitions necessary for the ecosystem and the infrastructure. Maybe Tom, I'll start with you first, which is what would be your view on the regionalization, which we talked about last year in SIEW 2020 as well, around the LTMS network, which then touches your point, Sylvia, on hydrogen, where they are green and in abundance in terms of say, hydroelectricity, but brought to where it's required. Maybe, Tom, I'll start with you on how do you think the region, right, can act cohesively to ensure that such imbalances are brought to bear in the energy transition topic?
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the points that Sylvie made about the technology helping here and, you know, sort of virtual grids supporting it. But in the sort of shorter term, I think we need to follow up on the momentum of last year's SIEW, where we saw those fantastic announcements about cross-border trading between Singapore and Malaysia and the signals of further progress to come later this year. So inevitably, there's some politics connected to that, but it's important, I think, to allow different parts of the region to play their part in the transition. And if you look up to, to Laos, who could become the battery of Southeast Asia, as we would very much support the work that would enable that, both in terms of grid, but also in terms of the political agreements that need to come into place, working through the ASEAN grouping to allow that to really play the effect that it could in accelerating the transition.
Yeah, so I think one of the dimensions in this systemic dimension I was mentioning is really that energy is also a matter of sovereignty, national strategy, so competitive advantage of the nations, and overall development and labor development notably. And so when it comes to that, G2G cooperation is needed. And of course, we talked about interconnections between places where you have abundant solar and places where you have consumption. The virtual version of that is actually carbon finance, which needs to be developed to be able to credibly, with the right real-time measurement and real-time offsetting and granular automation to allow to actually virtually transport from one place to the other, because we will not be able to solve everything physically. But in that cooperation scheme, the concept of developing specific sustainable competitive advantage as well as autonomy and resilience for every nation is important. So taking care of not creating too much interdependency and too much dependency is definitely something that is at the heart, I would think, of any state's strategy.
Okay. I want to take some questions from the audience that's sent in. The first one seems to be back to you again. The question is just, do you believe we have the ability to create one global mechanism to record the generation and registration of carbon credits or renewable energy certificates globally?
Yes, so we were saying that renewables are coming with more and more technology and more decentralization. So they need also, I think, to have the system of record which goes with that, which is more blockchain type of system of record, meaning more decentralized, more relying on multiple notaries and not one. We all know blockchain is also coming with some challenges in terms of energy consumption and redundancy. That's why some low energy blockchains are now emerging, which are the right balance between both. But long story short, we don't necessarily believe in one central focus point, but we definitely believe on automation, technology to actually measure and register in real time, and to bring credibility to the overall REC and more generally carbon credit market, because it's automated, because it's underpinned by IoT, and because it's fully blockchainized and transparent. And I totally believe that there are really three layers: the physical layer, the industrial layer, I would say, the digital one, which we commented, and this financial overlay of carbon economy, which is helping to virtualize this decarbonization and create the right incentives.
Okay, thank you. The last question I have is for you, Dolph. And the question is that so far, what is the most efficient and cost-effective clean and green technology in electricity generation today, and how much of it has been deployed in industries worldwide?
Well, in terms of electricity generation, renewable electricity generation, it depends a little bit on the resource quality. So we've seen solar PV projects in parts of the world for 1-2 cents per kilowatt hour, which of course the cheapest electricity available. But you have also locations where hydropower is available at 2 cents per kilowatt hour, maybe more relevant for the region. And of course, what is emerging now is very low cost offshore wind, both bottom fixed and even floating. So it continues to change as technology evolves, but across the board, very low cost renewable power. If the question was more directed towards industry, where maybe also co-generation and heat plays a role, I mentioned bioenergy, and in a Southeast Asia context, there are also interesting opportunities.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the answers. And all it leaves me is to thank Dolph, Tom, as well as Sylvie for participating in this panel. Round of applause for them, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you to our panelists and moderator. To pose a question, please use the Q&A feature. Let us know your name, organization, and if the question is directed to a particular speaker. For our guests on site, please email your question to ema_siew@ema.gov.sg. May I now invite Mr. Jeremy Bentham for his presentation on Shell's energy transformation scenarios. Mr. Bentham, please.
Hello there. It's lovely to be able to talk to you. I'm sorry I can't be with you at the Marina Sands, but I'm pleased to be able to speak to you from my own home where I'm locked down in Europe. Next slide, please. I'm going to be talking about future possibilities. And it's always important to remember that there are uncertainties ahead. And these aren't minor uncertainties, these are major uncertainties. And we have to deal with those. We have to make choices in that context. And in fact, our choices are aspects of shaping that future, and they are part of the uncertainty. So it's inevitable that we're going to have to deal with this, but we can think about this in a very responsible and systematic way. And if we can move to the next slide, I'm going to say something about scenarios for the future and what we can learn from them. So why scenarios? Well, because of that inevitable unpredictability, but also because our human nature is to be rooted in our current experience, in the status quo. And we have to stretch our thinking if we're going to make better informed decisions. We have to recognize that forecasts and sensitivities may be valuable in a very short term, but as we think over decades, the choices we are making can shape very, very different worlds. But as you will see from the bottom of this slide, we can learn from that. So our choices today affect the future, but thinking systematically about the future can affect our choices today. And Shell has been applying this approach now for over 50 years. And more recently, we have published earlier this year energy transformation scenarios that build on our work over decades of looking at energy system possibilities, in seeing many of the developments that have already been highlighted in that first session. I myself was the chief executive of Shell Hydrogen 20 years ago, and we were seeing the potential for solar power and wind power to become as large as they are today and as affordable also 25 years ago as well. So scenarios can help us all think and hopefully make better choices. So I can move to the next slide, please. In thinking responsibly about the future, we have to begin with what is the reality today, and then what can different choices mean in that context. And the reality today is a global pandemic with great insecurity and great turbulence in the world. And as we have looked around the world, as we have spoken to people in different parts of the world, we've recognized that there are three common priorities that are coming to the top of people's minds. The first is economic recovery, jobs, this focus on wealth as the first priority. But also, we have noticed the importance of the sense of security and recovering that. So security as a first priority. And naturally, in the wake of the pandemic, we see that health and public well-being are important priorities at the top of mind. And all societies, all governments are seeking all these objectives. But their particular circumstances, their particular nature may mean that one of the priorities becomes more prominent than the others. And our scenarios are exploring what happens if globally one of these priorities becomes more prominent than the others, even though all three are being focused on. So what I'm going to do is take you very briefly through each scenario and then try and draw the lessons from looking them all together, because we don't know what the future will bring. So if I can move to the next slide, please. Let me start with the waves outlook. I want to put you in a world where the sense of rebuilding resilience in the world is perceived as repairing the economy, economic resilience, jobs. And of course, you see all around the world this focus. And what you see is also economies being reopened quickly despite the pandemic. And so in many places, you're seeing waves of infection, opening up, infections coming, and then locking down again. That sense of waves. But looking beyond just the next few years, that sense of investing in economic resilience will, in this outlook, begin to continue to uplift that surge in economic development, that strong bounce back in the economy in the Asian region. And so naturally, with a surge in the economic activity, because you can't move or build or operate anything without energy, you get a surge in energy use, and hence this resurgence in energy-related emissions. But as well as this upsurge, there are undercurrents. We know that many people in many professions have been hailed as key workers and heroes in the current pandemic, and yet these people remain in relatively low-paid, unprivileged jobs. So you begin to see growing labor unrest over time as inequalities continue to grow. You see also that as climate events are continuing to happen, the fact there has been relatively modest attention to these over time, you get political blame for these events. And so you begin to get a backlash, an economic and labor market backlash, and a backlash against policies on fossil fuels. So you get rapidly policy-driven reductions in the use of coal and oil and natural gas. But these are coming late. These are coming after that first wave. So in the 2030s, you see peak coal, peak oil demand. And so we're getting, in this outlook, fast decarbonization, but late, really beginning in the 2030s. And so if you follow that through, you find that by the end of this century, you haven't achieved 1.5 degrees ambition, but are about 2.3 degrees above pre-industrial levels of temperature rise. That's the outcome of this form of choice. Let's move to the next slide, please. Let me take you into a different world, the world of islands, a world in which resilience is perceived as self-sufficiency and autonomy, a world of growing nationalism, a world, therefore, without that international collaboration, that you're seeing frictions in collaboration and trade. The types of tensions you have seen, for example, between China and the United States on trade remain in the world. And so there is stagnation in that area, and hence stagnation in global economic growth. Some islands do well, but some don't. And so, from an energy point of view, you're getting growth in energy service needs still. It's not that the economies go backwards, but the growth rate stalls. But also, with this lack of an international collaboration culture, you see global action on climate also stalls. Even in places like Europe, where you have the emissions trading scheme as a legal construct, even that begins to unravel. So the deployment of cleaner technology happens because much of it is already affordable, but it makes slow progress in its deployment, and the coming through of new technologies like hydrogen deployment are slow. So in this outlook, you continue to have emissions, and they're still rising by the end of the century and probably continuing until the 2130s. And you're 2.5 degrees temperature rise above pre-industrial levels. That's the outcome of this pattern of choice. Let me take you now to a third world. Next slide, please. This is a world in which resilience is perceived as repairing the institutional arrangements, whether those are in public health or in social welfare, that have been exposed in the pandemic as being weak. So well-being is the first priority. Let me call it Sky 1.5, because this is aimed at achieving the 1.5 degree goal and navigating through the storm clouds that were identified in the previous scenarios. This is a scenario of learning from each other, but also learning from past experiences. People proceed cautiously with reopening the economy, so you're getting steady growth, but slow in that, measured. There's recognition of the value in alignments, the alignments that have occurred amongst scientists in developing vaccines, the alignments that have occurred because people have been able to learn from good medical practices in other places, good lockdown practices in other places. People also begin to learn from things like the previous global financial recession from 2008-9, in which lessons from things like the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act showed the value of green investment in building jobs. Those connections there. This is a world in which you get competition emerging amongst China and Europe and the US around green technologies and green investment for domestic industrial purposes. So you get reshaping of the energy system, you get the deep structural changes that are lowering emissions, and indeed, you're able to achieve the ambitious Paris Agreement goal. So we can move to the next slide, please. Let's look at how these outlooks differ from an energy and emissions standpoint. You can see the impact on the left chart of quite broad differences in the energy demand, the primary energy demand. You see in the right-hand chart, very broad differences in the pathways towards decarbonization. But what can we learn from looking together at these? And if we can move to the next slide, please. We find that across all those different outlooks, the structure of change in the energy system is the same, but the issue is speed. Things move, for example, much faster in the Sky 1.5 scenario than in the island scenario. And there are these 5 factors, and many of these have already been highlighted in the earlier presentation from IRENA. So there's a growing need for energy because we have more people on the planet, we have more economic activity. As that dotted line shows, that's the outlook for the need for primary energy if there wasn't efficiency improvement. But you get very important efficiency improvements as well, not only in end-use technologies, but in infrastructures like combined heat and power and waste and water systems. We have deep electrification, up from 20% of the global economy today to almost 60% by the later part of the century, and largely from renewable sources. There is still a need for molecular fuels in those hard to electrify sectors, in sectors like aviation, marine, heavy industry, where you need thermal fuels or energy dense portable fuels as well. But they're increasingly decarbonized. Biofuels, hydrogen play an increasing role. Oil and gas remain important in key services, but are increasingly concentrated into premium services that are either hard to electrify or where carbon is captured in materials. Emissions removal has to make a contribution, whether that's through natural solutions such as reforestation or through restoring soil quality, or technologically through carbon capture and underground storage. Those are common trends across all outlooks. And if we look to the next slide, you see even in Asia, the same picture, the important growth, this change in the structure of the energy system. And also you see there solid fuels, largely coal and traditional biomass, still playing a role, but that also transforming into coal being focused into any primary sectors and traditional biomass being replaced by commercial fuels. If we can move to the next slide, I'd like to now assume that for various reasons, we all see the attractiveness of an outlook like Sky 1.5, where the damage and disruption caused by global climate change is minimized. And so we take a lot of time looking at lessons from the past and what can accelerate those kinds of choices. Who would have thought 30 or 40 years ago, for example, that solar power would now be affordable? And yet it is. Who would have thought 30 or 40 years ago that the passenger vehicle sector could become dominated eventually by battery electric vehicles? But it will be. How did this happen? And we find that crises have played an important role here, whether that was the oil supply crises in the 1970s, or the Asian financial crisis in the 1990s, the global financial crisis in 2008-9, the Fukushima nuclear crisis. All these have triggered certain things. And what's been triggered are alignments, public, private, and civil society alignments. We have seen that it's triggered smart policies. Policies, for example, that recognize that new technologies first need the kinds of policies that stimulate their development, then the kinds of policies like feed-in tariffs that take their deployment to a level where their mass scale means that they become cost effective, and then policies like carbon pricing that ensure these possibilities, once they are there, spread throughout the economy. And it's also taken pioneer leaders in the public sector and in the private sector. We can look at what has happened, for example, in California, where pioneer leaders in the government sector have set policies over a long time that deal with cleaner energy, where new companies like Tesla have been able to be in that supportive environment and create, through private sector action, an alignment with, first of all, wealthy technology seeking customers, and then a broader market on electric vehicles. So these are the lessons we can draw from, so we can make these choices to meet a scenario that looks more like the Sky 1.5 scenario. So we can move to the next slide, please. That look back and those lessons have shown that crises can indeed galvanize people into action. And I personally hope, I've been working in this space for many years now, but my company hopes also that the current crisis will galvanize people into action towards that better outlook. But it is not inevitable. We do have to make choices, and we have to recognize that we cannot be complacent. At current levels of emissions, temperature rises are about 0.2 degrees per decade. We're already at 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. So we will pass 1.5 degrees by the middle of the next decade, unless we are taking these actions that bring about the energy transformation. I hope you're with me on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Benton. Joining in the discussions are Ms. Yolanda Chong from BS and Ms. Jen Tan from Sembcorp Industries. Moderating the session is Mr. James Chong. Over to you, Mr. Chong.
Jen, thank you for joining us real time on stage here. And Jeremy, thank you too for that presentation. If I can just start with you on a continuation of the theme that you had brought up around Sky 1.5. And how do you see that being applied to a diverse geography like Asia, where you've got such a broad range of developing, developed nations, etc., in a cohesive and, as you said in your last slide, being galvanized, right, to achieve this Sky 1.5. Wouldn't that come at a very high cost, Jeremy?
Well, let me first of all agree with you that when there is diversity in countries, in regions, in societies, there is going to be a diversity in approach because different societies are industrially and economically in different phases of their development. So it will be different, but it can also be aligned. And in fact, domestic considerations of industrial competitiveness is going to be one of those forces of alignment. You talk about costs, but of course, costs can be phrased as a word in another way. These are investments. And you know then that what you're actually talking about is shifting where investments are taking place. And when we stand back and when other independent economists stand back, you see that the macroeconomic drag on development is very, very moderate. We're talking about the difference between a cleaner approach and a business as usual approach amounting to perhaps over the next 30 years, 1 year of economic development. It's in the margins of uncertainty around many, many other things as well. But it does mean that you're investing in one area rather than another area. So in the short term, if you're not careful, some sectors of society will feel disadvantaged compared to others, and that can create resistance. And somebody used the phrase earlier about just transition. And part of that smart policy lesson that I highlighted earlier are policies that enable all parts of society to feel that they are benefiting from the transition and hence support those changes.
If I were to ask you, Yolanda, on that point that Jeremy had brought up, how do you see, whether here in Asia we've reached that inflection point where traditional fossil energy is expensive from the broadest sense of the word, compared to renewables? And what are your thoughts on that, both from a private sector as well as maybe from a governmental kind of a sector?
Yes, the inflection point that you're referring to is about this grid parity that power generators talk about. Would the cost of generating 1 kilowatt hour of renewable energy be the same cost as using gas-fired or coal-fired power plants? But I think the inflection point is actually going to come earlier. The inflection point is about what makes a project, a power project, bankable. And I think the point has reached, even in Asia, that even though in certain geographies, you may still find coal-fired power plant being slightly cheaper than a solar PV farm, and you still find the project unbankable. And that is because this notion of stranded asset. But to emphasize, when a lot of the investors question banks or sponsors, project sponsors, about stranded assets, we are not the ones who are going to bear the stranded asset in a lot of the bankable deals that we did in the past. It's actually the export credit agencies, whether it is the guarantors from China, from Japan, from Korea. Many of these export credit agencies now have said, no, we are retreating from that market. And as a result, what was a bankable project has become unbankable. And so that's the inflection point, and we've got there.
Right, good. Now, switching over to a private sector energy management company, what would be your view, Jen, in terms of that landscape, both in Singapore and the kind of opportunities it therefore presents?
Maybe I share a little bit about my personal journey. I actually entered the solar industry back in 2009.
Right.
When you speak to people about solar, they just look at me as if I'm an insurance agent. No, it's too expensive, I'm not interested. I think that has changed tremendously. It has evolved totally. Last year, Singapore's government has said that we will accelerate our growth to 1.5 gigawatts by 2025. That message has sunk through, and we're talking about the green plan. So a lot of people are getting interested in solar. We have also achieved grid parity, and the prices are actually on par or even below the conventional power price. And because of the global pandemic, you will see that a lot of people know that destruction is real, interruption is real, and sustainability is no longer just a hearsay or people just feel like, okay, we need to do sustainability. It has become a need, and it's a very important part of our life. So I would say that the green growth is very important, and it's not just about businesses, it's about the ecosystem. Bankability, you need financiers who knows about the sustainability landscape. You need a lot of engineers to design and deal with the intermittency of green energy. You need digitalization to deal with the data, the big data that we actually gather from this. So it's an entire ecosystem and a lot of sustainability within sustainability to be built. So I feel that the industry is growing. Like what IRENA says, renewable energy is the way to go, and we are targeting more than half of the energy to be renewable. But as we grow, and with rapid growths, there will be a lot of risk that's involved. So I think it's important for all the businesses here who are going into renewable to focus on the ecosystem, people that is required to build this. Otherwise, I think that it will be counterproductive. So building of business development, commercial, financial. I think a few days ago, I was in this webinar together with Minister Iswaran. He was also saying we need to build the entire ecosystem. And for Singapore, we are well positioned for this. I mean, as we speak, Sembcorp, we have about 25% of Singapore's target, which is 370 megawatt today, out of the 1,005, and 10% of our total renewable energy portfolio. But I think what's important is we build the competency and the capabilities here, so that when we want to grow to the region, it's a cookie cutter, and you know, we focus on the sustainability of the growth. So I think the region, Vietnam and Indonesia is poised to be the next big growth in renewable energy. I think it's important to bring the capabilities that we built here to the region.
Now, we talked about earlier on, Yolanda brought out a point about potential current generation sources being potentially stranded assets. I guess we have lesser of an issue here in Singapore because 90% or 95% of our energy is gas produced. What would be your view on other countries around the region which still has quite a dependency on coal? And that transition may not be that easy, right? What are some of the lessons that you think would be useful?
I think the grid connectivity, the infrastructure of the grid is important. Renewable energy is intermittent. I mean, a lot of people are saying that battery has not reached maturity yet, so there's a lot of engineering going into battery, hydrogen and all that. So I think the engineers need to continue to work hard on this area. But looking at the growth in Vietnam, right, it has grown quite fast in the last 2 to 3 years. I think they are also focusing a lot on building the grid to be able to withstand the intermittency. I've heard of people, you know, trying to look at hydrogen, the excess power generated, you know, powering up hydrogen for other users. So people are getting very innovative. Hence, I focus on the point about building capabilities around this. As we grow fast, we also need to ensure that the growth is sustainable.
Right, right. Now, coming back to you, Yolanda, on the point about coal yet again, right? I mean, you've got countries where their power purchase agreements run into a lot more years than we have in the chart that Jeremy had mentioned, right? 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years. What would be your viewpoint on these assets that may appear stranded, but the agreements allow them to be financially viable, with the exception that there is the carbon emissions that it won't meet? What would be your view on that?
First, we can look at the economics. And the economics suggests that a lot of the new renewable generating assets are going to be able to operate at a lower cost compared to an existing operational conventional power plant. And I think that maybe we're only a few years away from getting to that point. And you are correct. We look at the power purchase agreement, extends to 15, 20 years. The loans from the banks going to these projects will be 15, 20 years. But that goes back to why we are not losing sleep over stranded assets. Because all this financing has been done with not just one layer of wrap, maybe 2 layers of guarantee by the government, guarantee by the export credit agencies. So in a way, the banks have made a calculated risk adjustment to say, yes, we know it is risky, but we're not holding the baby. We won't be left holding the baby. It will be someone else. So I think in a lot of the Asian markets, we're not a merchant market yet. We're still governed by the PPAs. And the idea of just transition really needs to take into account a lot of the capacity payments being paid out to power generators that are guaranteed a payment for the next 20 years at a very high cost compared to renewables. We all have mobile phones. If I go to a telecom network provider and they offer me a relatively attractive tariff, but I know with relative certainty 6 months from now, I'll be able to do that much cheaper. Would you still sign a 3-year contract? No. So I think that the economics, the politics of it. You know, the consumers are going to revolt if you keep charging them a tariff that is not going to be reflective of the real cost of generation.
Now, how does that play, Jeremy, from your view of Asia? And I know you had given us some view on the position insofar as Asia is concerned, with regards to the investment strategy from Shell's perspective.
Thanks very much. It's been said, I think by Gandhi, that the future is shaped by the choices we make today. And so
Yes.
we have been making choices over a period of time that are associated with energy transformations. But really our global strategy now is focused on taking lessons from others and lessons of success, lessons from our own history, and investing forward. So globally, we have a strategy, but it's very, very significantly focused in Asia because much of the change in the energy system is coming in Asia. So we have one block of investments that we call the growth pillar, recognizing that the need for energy services is going to continue to grow, and that is going to need to be served, but it's going to grow in a different way. So our marketing businesses, including charging of electric vehicles, a major thrust, for instance, in Singapore, is going to be there. Developing our hydrogen business so that we're seeing a smooth transition from people using coal as a form of thermal power into using liquefied natural gas, a very quick transition that can be made, but then increasingly use of hydrogen as well. So we have this renewable power and renewable energy services pillar. We have another pillar which is focused on assets and often repurposing assets. So indeed, in Singapore itself, we have our big refinery and chemicals plant, but repurposing that towards the needs of a transforming energy system, including the needs for lightweighting chemicals, the needs for biofuels, etc., over time. And indeed, working with partners, I think we're working with Sembcorp on a trial on using hydrogen fuel cells in vessels within the Singapore context as well. And then our third pillar is actually the upstream. We know the world is going to need natural gas, some oil for a period of time, but we can work with major resource holders about developing and producing that responsibly and lowering emissions there. So we can help be part of the growing energy system and lower emissions across these three different pillars. And indeed, just taking the Singapore example, we are committed and targeting reducing by 2030 our emissions from our own operations, which are heavy industry operations largely in Singapore, by 30%. So all these things fit together, but we have then these growth, transition, and upstream pillars that can help us focus our investment.
I've got a question, and you half answered it from one of our audience. I'm going to start with the audience's question as well, which is the role of LNG. And you briefly mentioned about hydrogen and the complementary nature of LNG as well. Given that LNG has been, I wouldn't say played up, but it has been often touted as would you consider it as an interim move to hydrogen as a less carbon producing form of energy, but a necessary interim solution?
Yeah, I think that is certainly one way of thinking of it. And I suspect that as that develops, there is the possibility that some amount of natural gas will remain part of the system, but then combined with carbon capture and storage. Today, you're making much hydrogen today for industrial purposes. It's basically made out of methane, out of natural gas. And so you combine that with the carbon capture and storage, and you can see that liquefied natural gas can not only be helpful in the transition from coal, but in getting the hydrogen industry up and going as well. And if it goes in a certain way, there will be electrolysis from renewable energy, from renewable electricity, but there will also, I think, be elements that still come from natural gas.
Yes, yes, yes. Thank you. Now, I'm going to reserve the last 2 minutes for the two of you. And one of the audience have actually talked about the announcement last year on the solar power generation in Australia and having an MOU with Singapore. So I'll ask the two of you, maybe start with you, Jen, with regards to the viability of such a solution, and then the enormous cost that it must come with.
Yeah, I think the idea is great, but the question is how do we optimize the cost of the undersea cable and bringing the intermittency of the power into Singapore. I mean, to make it viable, you need volume, but to have high volume in solar, we produce in a bell curve, and then you have to produce at peak, and to bring in that peak, and then during cloudy days, you have this intermittency. So I think the challenge to this is really the cost of the cable and the infrastructure cost that comes along.
What do you think it takes to do something like that? It must be quite an undertaking.
I think in general, transboundary power sharing is ideal. And whether I think the technology is available, then it comes down to costs. And when we talk about energy markets, we want to optimize the market. And now the market is global, or at least regional. So that means whether we are piping electricity generated in Australia or from neighboring countries like Malaysia, all those options, we should be open-minded about them.
Now, thank you very much, Jen and Yolanda, as well as Jeremy, for your time. Thank you, and I wish you a good day in the UK, and thank you to the both of you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you once again to our panelists and moderator. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to meeting you at SIEW this October. Thank you once again, and have a great day ahead.